That's a mystery.
Investigations into crimes committed often lead to physical evidential proof or an eyewitness who could account for the illegal activity being conducted. But what if an investigation and conviction was initially led by none of these? What if they started from the most unlikely source any person could imagine? Greenbrier County, West Virginia, 1896. It was a crisp autumn afternoon. The leaves of the trees surrounding this fairly new county had begun to change, from the luscious green that matched the grass that covered the ground to beautiful orange and red tones. The breeze was just enough to begin to strip the branches of these delightful colors, bringing them to the earth itself. A young woman was on her way home, enjoying the sights that Mother Nature provided in October. Nearing her mother's home, in which she still dwelled as she was unmarried, her eyes found a different sight that captivated her. There stood a man, dark hair that matched her own, and eyes that instantly locked with hers. The man, Erasmus Stribling Trout Shue, introduced himself to the woman. Known by many names, Erasmus, Edward, or even Trout, he explained that he was new in town and that he was in search of a shelter. A blacksmith by trade, he moved to the countryside in hopes of finding better opportunities. But alas, nothing had come to fruition. The woman exchanged pleasantries, sharing her name with her newly found friend, Elva Zona Heaster, but many called her by her middle name, Zona. Zona and Erasmus quickly became infatuated with one another. They would spend every day together, and their romance rapidly grew, much to Zona's mother's dismay. There was something that Zona's mother, Mary Jane Heaster, felt that Erasmus, that her mother's intuition gave her a negative feeling. Despite warnings and mother-daughter conversations about the situation, as well as the very brief time that they'd had known each other, Zona would accept the marriage proposal from Erasmus and soon be wed to her future husband. The newlywed couple found a home to start their family together, a cabin constructed of red oak logs, surrounded by a white three-tiered fence on the outskirts of town. Just like their relationship and marriage, they wasted no time in starting their family and future together. Zona would quickly become pregnant, bearing their first and hopefully many of Erasmus's children. About 3 months had passed, and Zona began to question the health of her pregnancy. Prior to meeting Erasmus, Zona had been pregnant and had given birth before, doing so out of wedlock. She had been through this miraculous experience before and knew something was wrong with the child of her husband. Zona had experienced the complications to her husband, fearful that she may lose their first child together. The next day, Erasmus got dressed and prepared himself for another full day of work. As he departed from his log cabin home, he crossed paths with a young boy, who was a neighbor to the Shues. Erasmus requested that the boy stop at the Shue household later to check in on his wife and see if she required any items from the local market. As the boy agreed, Erasmus headed on his way towards town. The boy would then start running towards the Shue cabin, eager to fulfill this request. Huffing and puffing, the boy made his way to the Shue residence. After stepping over the bottom plank and squeezing his small body through the paint-chipped fence, he trotted towards the front door. Balling his hand into a fist, he knocked on the front door. With no initial response, he continued to bang on the wooden door, yelling for Mrs. Shue repeatedly. After a couple of minutes, the boy stopped and decided to open the door on his own will. He pushed with both hands, and with the aid of the winter winds, the door swung open swiftly. There, on the floor, laid Zona, right at the foot of the staircase. Her body was stretched out, legs together, and as straight as an arrow. One arm was at her side, while the other rested across her bosom. Her head was tilted to the side. He continued to call for Mrs. Shue, but no movement or response at all. Thinking she was asleep, the boy turned around and returned to his home, where he informed his mother of the situation. Once the boy had made it back to his house, he burst through the door screaming for his mother. The concerned mother quickly ran towards the boy and reached out with both arms to console her son. The son explained the entire situation, and the mother quickly put on her overcoat, as she would immediately visit the local doctor to inform him of Zona's condition. Dr. George W. Knapp, doctor and coroner. That is what is displayed on 2 withered plank boards outside a small building in town. The boy's mother hastily entered and frantically called for the doctor. Dr. Knapp immediately responded and listened to the story of Zona's condition. Worried as any doctor would be, he grabbed his medical bag and set out to the Shue residence. Once the doctor made it to the Shue home, he noticed that the door was closed. He was told by the boy's mother that the boy had left it open as he ran home. The doctor entered the house, and at first glance, Zona's body was no longer at the foot of the staircase. He made his way upstairs and was shocked to see Erasmus in the master bedroom, sitting alongside his wife, who appeared to be bathed and dressed elegantly. High-collar dark dress with the collar as stiff as a doornail, and a veil laying gently over her lifeless-looking face. The doctor set his medical bag down and began to examine Zona. Once the doctor got close, Erasmus burst into tears, clutching Zona's head close to his chest. As the doctor got close to Zona's head, Erasmus's attitude changed drastically. He yelled at the doctor and did not let him continue with the examination. The doctor packed his things and promptly left the home. The next day, Erasmus visited the doctor and apologized for his actions the prior day. Knowing that Erasmus was emotionally shaken with the situation of his wife, the doctor accepted his apology and agreed to continue to evaluate and treat Zona. After a few minutes, the doctor sadly concluded that Zona had passed away. His initial conclusion was that Zona suffered from everlasting fainting, though after further diagnosis, Dr. Knapp changed his opinion and confirmed that the death was caused by complications from the pregnancy. Zona's body was taken to the local cemetery for her funeral and burial. During the funeral, Erasmus seemed very stressed. He paced back and forth in front of the wooden casket that his deceased wife lay in. Zona was dressed in what many considered abnormal. Her outfit was far from what they considered traditional burial apparel. The same dress with the stiff collar she was donning when Dr. Knapp initially examined her. Additionally, a scarf covered her pale face and portion of her neck that the collar did not hide. Every other pass by the body, Erasmus was seen straightening and fixing her collar. The townsfolk who attended took notice of Erasmus's odd behavior, but most chalked it up to being a grieving spouse. There was one particular attendee who saw otherwise, none other than Mary Jane Heaster. Her eyes were locked on Erasmus's every move. The initial sadness at the loss of her daughter was quickly replaced with curiosity and anger. The piercing gaze from the now daughterless mother could tear apart any material set before her. She knew there was more to this unfortunate death than what Dr. Knapp concluded. As volunteers shoveled the nearly frozen dirt to create the resting place of Zona Shue, Mary Jane let out what tears she had left, turned around, and left her daughter one last time. Or so she thought. Back at the Heaster residence, Mary Jane had dressed in her nightly attire to prepare for what might be a night that she would remember for the rest of her days. Falling to her knees, she put her hands together next to her bedside candle and began to pray. In her prayers, she called out for her daughter, repeating her name over and over. Mary Jane said she would give anything to speak to her just one more time, and to find out what happened on that dreadful day. After the lengthy prayer, Mary Jane shed a tear, blew out the candle, and retired for the evening. Mary Jane would wake a few hours later to the brightest light her eyes had ever witnessed. The room dropped in temperature, making it almost as cold as the outdoor winter chill. Confused, she questioned what was happening. Was it morning? Was a window left open? Worse, did she die? Suddenly, the bright light started to take form. As it began to shape itself, the figure started to become that of a young woman. Once Mary Jane regained focus and took another look, she saw what she had least expected. Her daughter, Zona. The ghostly figure would tell Mary Jane about the final days of her short-lived life, the abuse that her husband had put her through. Before Mary Jane could get a word out, the figure dissipated and the room returned to its normal state. Mary Jane hardly slept for the remainder of the night. All she could picture was that figure of her daughter, and the disturbing information she was provided. For the next few nights, Mary Jane would repeat the same process as she did that spiritual night: the candle, the prayer, and falling asleep shortly thereafter. Each night, the same spectacle would occur, and the ghost claiming to be her daughter would tell her more about the sickening experiences with her husband. During the fourth night of the spirit's visit, Mary Jane was told the most gruesome details of all. Every evening, just as any housewife would do, Zona prepared dinner for her husband. The night before her body was discovered by the small boy, Zona cooked a meal that consisted primarily of carrots and potatoes. Erasmus came home hungry and with his mind fixated on a thick, juicy steak. As Zona served the meal she had prepared, Erasmus took one look and demanded that there should be a slab of meat on his dinner plate. Zona apologized as they had no meat readily available. Not pleased at all to hear this news, Erasmus's mood switched as quickly as he swiped his plate off the wooden dinner table. As the plate shattered into hundreds of pieces, Erasmus approached Zona, his face mere inches away from hers. Without warning, both of his hands, which had been battle-tested through years of blacksmithing, grasped the neck of his unsuspecting wife. He squeezed with all his might and rage, as if he was wringing out a soaked washcloth. His eyes remained fixated on her helplessness. The ghost, who was sitting at the foot of Mary Jane's bed, stood up and began to walk away. As she started to walk, her neck slowly began to twist and continued to do so until her face was centered with her spinal cord. Her last words, "He broke my neck." The ghost had began to fade away with a facial expression that appeared to have a combination of sadness and shame. Mary Jane quickly awoke in a cold sweat. She knew that Erasmus was behind this tragedy, however, simultaneously knowing that she could not say how she came about this vital information. The next morning, Mary Jane got dressed and went into town to visit the local prosecutor, John Preston. When she arrived at the office of Mr. Preston, she entered with haste and wanted to blurt out everything she knew in one breath. After several deep breaths, Mary Jane explained to Mr. Preston all the reasons why he should reopen the investigation on her daughter's death. She even told of the eerie visits from her deceased daughter. After an entire afternoon of persuasion and a bit of begging, Mr. Preston promised Mary Jane that he would reopen the case and do additional investigations. Mr. Preston would meet with those who knew the Shue family, neighbors and friends alike. They all told similar stories, how odd Erasmus Shue was acting after the discovery of his wife's body, as well as the funeral itself. Dr. Knapp, who Mr. Preston also spoke with, explained that his examination was incomplete and that he had felt pressured by Erasmus to reach a conclusion quickly on Zona's death. Hearing all the testimonials, Mr. Preston knew more had to be done with this case. He needed proof that Zona's death was no accident. The only way for him to determine if foul play was involved was to do the action that no family member or friend wanted to hear. The body of Elva Zona Heaster Shue must be exhumed for an autopsy. News broke out that the exhuming of Zona's body would be occurring. This upset Erasmus, obviously. He pled to Mr. Preston and other officials that her body was not to be disturbed, and it would be the ultimate form of disrespect to unearth her from her eternal resting place. Despite his cries for the appeal, the exhuming and autopsy proceeded. Dr. Knapp and 2 other doctors examined the body in a nearby schoolhouse. After careful examination, it was determined that Mrs. Shue suffered a dislocated neck between the first and second vertebrae. Ligaments were torn and ruptured, and the windpipe was severely crushed at the point in front of the neck. Around the neck, there were marks of fingers and the formation that appeared that she was choked. Dr. Knapp reported his findings to Mr. Preston. This was enough to put Erasmus Shue into serious questions surrounding the death of his wife. Mr. Preston invested all of his time and focus on Erasmus Shue, his history, who he had relationships with, his emotional state of mind, anything at all to do with this man. The more Mr. Preston uncovered, the more sense it made that Erasmus was behind the death of Zona. Abuse towards his first wife while his second love passed away prematurely, bragging about his goal of marrying 7 women in his lifetime, doing prison time for stealing horses. Mr. Preston had seen and heard enough. Erasmus Shue must go to trial for the death of his wife Zona. It was a warm afternoon on June 22, 1897. On a normal day, the townsfolk would be hard at work while the children played. Today was different. It was the day that Erasmus Shue would face a jury and attempt to defend himself from a murder charge. The star witness was none other than Mary Jane Heaster, the one who was able to fuel the reopening of the entire investigation. Prior to going under oath, Mr. Preston pleaded to Mary Jane that she exclude any details surrounding the spirit that visited her during those 4 winter nights. He led with questions that had pure fact backed with answers, but the defense had other ideas. Erasmus's lawyer knew about these ghost stories of Mary Jane and directly went to that topic, hoping that it would make her testimony unbelievable. Under oath, she would tell the complete and honest truth. How the ghost was her daughter, the abuse she suffered, and the eventual death at the hands of her stone-cold killer husband. The defense continued to badger Mary Jane about the spiritual visits, and she continued to tell the same story with authority. Much to the surprise of Mr. Preston and the dismay of Erasmus and his defense team, the jury and community seemed to believe the story and testimony of Mary Jane. After a few weeks of trial and deliberation, on July 11, 1897, Erasmus Shue was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison. He would spend less than 2 years in the West Virginia penitentiary, however. On March 13, 1900, Erasmus died from an illness that stemmed from an unknown epidemic. His body was buried in the local cemetery. Zona Shue was put back to rest after the autopsy in the cemetery known today as the Soul Chapel Methodist Cemetery. Though the murder case of Zona Heaster Shue was tried and closed, questions remain to this day. Was there really a ghost that helped convict a murderer? Was it actually Mary Jane Heaster that killed her daughter, as she knew all of the gruesome details? Or did Mary Jane use her hatred towards Erasmus Shue and convince the masses that he was indeed the killer? It is all part of the mystery of the Greenbrier Ghost. Thanks for listening. We drop new episodes every other week. Be sure to like and subscribe and hit the bell to be notified of our new episodes.